Don't come back here, because my girlfriend and I are going to live in this house. On the day my 3-year-old daughter was discharged from the hospital after a month-long stay, I came home to find my husband living with his mistress. Shocked by my husband's betrayal, both he and his mistress laughed at me as if they were making fun of me. On top of that, my husband had the nerve to call me back to the house to clean up the mess he made, effectively kicking me out. Furious, I consulted with some people and brought my husband and his mistress down to hell. My name is Emily. I met my husband, Michael, through an introduction from my sister's husband, and we live together with our daughter, now 3 years old. The house we live in was built while I was pregnant. We have filled it with our preferences, keeping everything white both inside and out, and I really liked it. However, because white shows dirt easily, it requires a lot of attention to cleaning. Moreover, my husband gets very grumpy if there is even a small stain, getting upset when our young daughter spills rice on the floor or dirties the walls. But he never cleans it himself, he just tells me this place is dirty. Because my husband claims to like cleanliness, he points out every little detail, and I have been getting quite fed up with it lately. Initially, I quit my job and was a full-time housewife after we got married, but when our daughter started kindergarten, I decided to start working part-time to save money for the future. I have started working, so I wish my husband would help out a bit more with housework and childcare, but according to him, the part-time job is something I decided to do on my own. Therefore, he left all the household and childcare responsibilities to me, just like before. One day, after sending our daughter to kindergarten, my sister and her husband, who live nearby, were supposed to visit our house. I tried to tidy up the house as much as possible while helping my daughter get ready in the morning. My husband didn't like that our daughter was touching things with her messy hands and called me before he left for work, complaining that I wasn't disciplining her properly. Even though he used to adore our daughter when she was just born, lately he has been looking at her as if she is something dirty. I try not to show it on my face in front of our daughter, but his attitude has been really bringing me down. Because my husband complained, I was running late to take my daughter to kindergarten and was in a hurry to get back home to meet my sister and her husband. They had decided to visit just 2 days before. When they called to ask if I had time to meet, I thought they must have something to talk about, but when I saw them at the front door, I realized it was not going to be good news. I invited my sister and her husband into the living room, and although they complimented our always clean house, their expressions remained stern. After I served them coffee, my sister's husband finally gathered the courage to speak. "Actually, I've heard some not so good rumors about Michael." What he said next was unbelievable. Apparently, my husband was having an affair with a coworker. My husband was originally introduced to me by my sister's husband, but he wasn't directly acquainted with him, it was through a mutual friend of theirs, my husband's brother, in other words my brother-in-law. My brother-in-law's friend works at the same company as my husband, and he had heard some bad rumors from a colleague. One of the colleagues said that a female coworker had been going around saying she has a boyfriend in the company, and it seemed like she was talking about my husband. Just as my brother-in-law's friend was trying to discreetly find out if the rumors were true, he accidentally stumbled upon my husband and the woman together. They weren't even trying to hide it, openly flirting in the company. His friend was shocked, took a photo of them and reported it to my brother-in-law. Then my brother-in-law told my sister's husband with the photos. Even though my sister's husband initially couldn't believe it, he had to accept it as the truth when he saw the photo evidence. He even has the photos with him, but I chose not to look at them. My sister and her husband apologized to me, saying they were sorry for introducing me to a man who would cheat. Even after finding out about my husband's affair, I was at a loss for what to do. I had never doubted my husband before hearing this story from my sister's husband, and more than anything, I didn't want to take my daughter's father away from her. But at the same time, I couldn't stand the thought of being cheated on. I was about to talk to my sister and her husband about what to do next when suddenly my phone rang. I answered the phone. It was from my daughter's kindergarten, telling me that she had a high fever and asking me to come pick her up. "It seems like my daughter has a fever, so I need to go pick her up." When I said that, my sister and her husband, who had come by car, offered to pick up my daughter with me, so the 3 of us went to pick her up together. When we arrived at the kindergarten, my daughter was completely exhausted, and it was clear that it wasn't just a common cold. Her cheeks seemed a bit swollen, and her homeroom teacher told us that there was a child in the class who had gotten mumps, so she suspected that my daughter might have it as well. We rushed to the hospital, and at the reception, we told them that we suspected she might have mumps. Given my daughter's condition, they decided she needed to undergo some tests as there was a possibility she might have developed complications. While waiting for the test results, I got anxious and called my husband. But he didn't answer and he didn't call me back. In the meantime, my daughter's test results came back, and it turned out she had mumps and had developed meningitis. She was admitted to the hospital right away and moved to a hospital room. After we received an explanation about the hospitalization, and since my daughter was fast asleep, I decided to go home to prepare for the stay. My sister and her husband offered to stay with my daughter, so I called a taxi and went home. When it was completely dark outside, my husband finally returned my call. He seemed upset that I called him while he was at work, and in an irritated voice, he said to me, "Don't call me during work." I told him that our daughter had a fever, that we took her to the hospital, and that she was admitted with meningitis. However, he seemed not to grasp the seriousness of the situation and said, "You're there with her, so don't call me for every little thing. I'll be staying at the hospital to accompany her for a while. All right, I'll leave it to you." And with that, without a single word of concern for our daughter, he just hung up on me. In the end, my daughter was in the hospital for over a month. My sister and her husband, as well as my parents and my in-laws, were all worried and came to visit many times, but my husband never visited once. When the day for my daughter's discharge was decided, I asked my husband to pick us up by car, but he refused, saying he was too busy with work. I told this to my sister, and then my sister and her husband offered to come pick us up. On the day of my daughter's discharge, my sister's husband drove us, and I went home with my daughter, who was completely back to normal after a long while. However, when we got home, my husband's car was in the parking lot, even though he was supposed to be at work. And in the window, I could see the silhouette of someone who wasn't my husband. It was clearly a woman. My sister and her husband noticed the silhouette as well, and they were furious, saying, "That's definitely the cheating partner." I held them back from storming in and, leaving my daughter who had fallen asleep in the car with them, I went inside alone. When I got to the living room, there was a woman right next to my husband, just as I had seen from the window. When my husband noticed I was back, he hastily put some distance between him and the woman, but I had already seen everything. "Hey, I'm back. Who's this?" I asked my husband. Instead of answering, my husband stepped in front of the woman as if to hide her from me. Ignoring my question, he asked me, "Why are you here?" I couldn't believe it. He had forgotten the day of our daughter's discharge. "I told you today was the day she's getting out of the hospital." "No way, you said it was tomorrow. You tricked me into coming back today." He must have been so preoccupied with bringing his mistress home that he completely forgot about our daughter. The mistress peeked her face from behind my husband and, looking at me, she smiled mockingly. Then she said to my husband, "This is your wife? What a pudgy old lady." Hearing that, my husband also changed his attitude and said, "I know, right? Look, I think you can tell, but I've got a young and cute girlfriend now. We've decided to live here together, so you should not come back." My husband said that, and put his arm around the cheating partner's shoulders as if to guess. I remembered when my sister's husband told me about the affair, I hesitated to divorce him. However, after seeing his behavior during our daughter's hospitalization, any love I had for him had completely disappeared. He never visited our daughter in the hospital, not even once, and he expected me to do all the house chores as usual. I had taken time off from my part-time job and was exhausted from going back and forth between the hospital and home. Instead of caring for me, he was taking advantage of my absence to spend time with his mistress in our house. I was being forced to clean up after my husband and his mistress. "Don't come back home," he had the audacity to say that, but I didn't have the energy to argue anymore. So, I quickly packed my things and went back to the car where my sister and her husband were waiting. My husband and his mistress were laughing as they watched me leave. Back in the car, I told my sister and her husband what my husband had said. They were about to storm out of the car, but I stopped them. I didn't want my daughter to see her father like that, so I asked my sister and her husband to take us to my parents' house. Afterwards, I stayed at my parents' house where my sister and her husband live. Both my parents and my sister's family welcomed my daughter and me warmly. My daughter didn't say she wanted to go back to our house, and she gradually got better while recuperating at my parents' house. My husband, starting from around the time my daughter began to crawl, was concerned only about getting dirty and didn't even hold her, so his affection for our daughter was only for a brief moment. She probably hardly has any memories of being fondly cared for by her father. She never said she wanted to meet her father or that she was feeling lonely. I didn't have the energy to talk things out when we went back to our house, so I just left, but I couldn't let things with my husband go on like this. Since my daughter had recovered enough to possibly go back to kindergarten, I finally started to think about what to do about my husband. One day, I received a call from my husband. While wondering what he would say, I answered the phone, and he told me, "The house is dirty, come back and clean it." Even though he should be living in that house with his affair partner, it seemed like she was also a person who doesn't do housework, just like him. Well, my sister had told me she was young, so she might not have lived alone before and probably left all the housework to her family. It was my husband who told me not to come back, but now he's telling me to come back just to clean, which is an incredibly selfish thing to say. I declined my husband's request in amazement. "You should clean your own house. Or maybe that girl you're having an affair with can do it." I said that and hung up the phone. My husband called several times after that, but I ignored him and didn't answer any more of his calls. He must be fuming on the other end of the line, not knowing what will happen to us from here on. That night, after having my parents put my daughter to bed, I was folding laundry in the living room. Then, I heard some commotion at the front door, so I went to see what it was. When I opened the door, there stood my husband and his affair partner, completely drenched from head to toe in red. Behind them, my sister and her husband, as well as my in-laws, were glaring at them, making sure they couldn't run away. My husband and his affair partner apologized, saying, "We are truly sorry." However, my sister, her husband, and my in-laws didn't accept their apology. What was covering them from head to toe was not blood, but tomato juice. After my husband had called me to clean the house, I immediately told my sister and her husband, as well as my in-laws, about it. First, my sister and her husband went to visit my husband, and while they were doing that, my in-laws, who live a little distance away, also headed to my husband's place by car. My sister and her husband lured my husband out to the garden under the pretext of borrowing some gardening tools I had, and as soon as my husband turned his back, they threw tomatoes at him. When he turned around in surprise, they also hit his face with tomatoes. These tomatoes were overripe and had become very soft, and they were waste products from a farm owned by a relative of my sister's husband. They probably wouldn't cause much pain when hitting someone, but the insides would splatter out immediately, which seemed to have an effect on my husband, who likes cleanliness. My sister and her husband didn't give my husband a chance to fight back and kept throwing tomatoes at him. The tomatoes hit not only my husband but also the pure white exterior walls of the house, and my husband screamed. While all this was happening, my in-laws arrived, and my husband was being pelted with tomatoes by my sister and her husband as well as my in-laws. Hearing my husband's screams as he ran around in a panic, the affair partner, suspicious of what was happening, showed her face in the garden, and then she too was hit with tomatoes. She tried to escape back into the house, but my sister dragged her back out into the garden, and she ended up running around with my husband. Every time my husband and the exterior walls got dirty, he let out a pitiful scream, and the affair partner also started to cry and scream in panic. By the time my sister, her husband, and my in-laws had thrown all the tomatoes they brought, the two of them had completely quieted down, and they were led to my parents' house nearby on foot. It seemed like the neighbors gave them strange looks as they passed by, but no one intervened. Actually, I was listening over the phone the whole time since my sister and her husband arrived at my husband's place. I can never forgive what my husband and his lover did, but hearing my pathetic husband's voice and the lover's cries, I felt a bit better. And seeing the pitiful sight of the two of them desperately apologize to me, I couldn't help but find it hilarious. This plan was suggested by my sister's husband after my daughter was discharged from the hospital. Doubting my husband's attitude when our daughter was hospitalized, I thought of installing the baby monitor we used when she was a baby in our bedroom. I suspected that if my sister's husband was right, my husband might have invited his lover to our house while my daughter and I were away. I was nervous that the baby monitor, hidden in the shadow of a houseplant, would be found at any moment, but luckily neither my husband nor his lover found it, and it captured both of their actions perfectly. From the day my daughter was hospitalized, it seemed like my husband was enjoying a quasi-cohabitation with his lover at our house. Every time I came home, I saved the recorded footage as evidence. After my daughter was discharged and my husband's infidelity was confirmed, I told my sister and her husband about the video evidence and consulted them about what to do next. They first suggested getting my in-laws on my side. My in-laws live about a 30-minute drive away and are calm people, never seen angry unlike my husband. I went to my in-laws' house with my sister and her husband, bringing the evidence with us. At first, my in-laws didn't believe that their son could cheat. But when we showed them the footage, they saw my husband being intimate with his lover, and they had no choice but to believe my story. Moreover, my husband not only told his lover that he would leave me, but he also said about our daughter, she just messes up the house, not cute at all. I'll throw her out along with her mom. Hearing this, my in-laws were furious. They wanted to go to my husband right away, but my sister, her husband, and I stopped them. My husband had been defiant when he found out that I knew about the affair, so we thought that getting a divorce right away would be just what he wanted. We didn't want things to go his way, so we discussed with my in-laws how we might be able to punish my husband. They were also unable to forgive what they saw on the video, so they immediately agreed to our plan. After discussing it together, we decided to throw tomatoes at him, a suggestion from my sister's husband who had studied in Spain, inspired by the tomato festival there. We thought it would be satisfying since my husband hates getting dirty, and throwing tomatoes, which wouldn't cause injury, seemed like a good idea. It was also perfect timing because my sister's husband's relatives are farmers, and they had an excess of tomatoes that were about to be thrown away. At first, I was bewildered by this outlandish idea, but I realized that normally, this kind of behavior wouldn't be enough. I thought he deserved to feel a bit of pain from being hit by tomatoes, so I decided to go along with his idea. My sister, her husband, and my in-laws were to carry out the plan. I wanted to throw tomatoes at my husband too. But I was still worried about my daughter's condition and couldn't leave my parents' house. Moreover, my sister and her husband felt guilty for introducing me to my husband, and my in-laws felt responsible for raising their son the way they did, so it was decided that the four of them would carry out the plan without me. I made them promise to do it outside the house and not inside. Although I'm disappointed that I couldn't throw tomatoes myself, seeing the pathetic sight of my husband and his lover thanks to the four of them made me feel refreshed. Of course, I've already talked to my parents about my husband's affair, so when my husband and his lover were taken to my parents' house, they were like sitting on pins and needles. I threw the divorce papers at my husband, who couldn't see my eyes. Let's get divorced. I have all the evidence of your affair. You must pay child support. Hearing the word child support, the lover raised her voice in disbelief. It seems she was dreaming of marrying my husband, becoming a housewife, and living a comfortable life. Thinking that she would be trapped in debt from paying child support, she started to deny everything, saying, "I have nothing to do with this man." I then told them about the baby monitor footage I had. At that point, the lover started to argue that it was an invasion of privacy, and my husband, supporting her, threatened to sue me. However, my in-laws and my sister and her husband scolded them harshly. Still terrified from being pelted with tomatoes, the two of them quickly fell silent. And when I told my husband again to agree divorce, he started grumbling. "I've been supporting you all this time, and since you're a housewife, you should obey your husband. You can't even clean properly, you were a useless wife. It's only natural that I cheated on you." My husband made a sarcastic remark about whether a part-time working mother could make a living. However, there was a reason for my decision to go back to my parents' house this time. It was not only that my parents and my sister and her husband welcomed me, but I was also offered a full-time position at my part-time job. When I told my husband about this, he clicked his tongue in frustration. And then I declared to my husband that my daughter and I would never return to that house again. Sure enough, my husband started making a fuss about who would clean the walls of that house, but after all, it was my husband who cheated, and he was entirely at fault. I told him to clean it himself, and he started demanding that I pay for the exterior cleaning. My in-laws were fed up with my husband for bringing up such a matter at this point and disowned him on the spot. Having been disowned by his parents-in-law, my husband, for some reason, proposed to his mistress. Covered in tomato and having lost all her love for my husband due to the humiliation and the prospect of having to pay child support, the mistress promptly rejected his proposal. She said to my husband, "I'm not interested in a penniless man," and he was left dumbfounded. And then, under our glaring eyes, my husband reluctantly agreed to our divorce. We told them that we would talk further through a lawyer, and we sent my husband and his mistress away. I don't know what they talked about on their way back, but apparently, they ended up cursing each other out and parted ways. Afterward, my husband ended up living alone in that house, working hard to pay the mortgage and child support. It seems that my husband tried to ask his brother for help, but he coldly turned him away and cut ties with him. Now, my husband had no family to rely on. As for the mistress, due to the bad rumors about her relationship with my husband, she apparently quit her job. Having quit her job, the mistress's affair was discovered by her parents, and it seems that she is likely to be disowned just like my husband. She was kicked out of her parents' house and is now living in a cheap, run-down apartment, working part-time during the day and in the nightclub at night. My sister once saw the mistress working at the register of a store, and she said that she was so emaciated that she wouldn't have recognized her if she hadn't looked at her name tag, and she definitely didn't look like she was in her early 20s. It's sad to think about how many happy moments she could have had, and how a single mistake could change a person's life so drastically. As for me, I started working full-time with the support of my parents and my sister and her husband who welcomed me back to my parents' house. It's tough at times, but I'm starting to feel a sense of accomplishment as I'm gradually being entrusted with more work. My daughter has also gotten used to living at my parents' house and is doing well every day. When we were living with my husband, she didn't get along very well with adult men, probably because my husband often yelled at her, but now she is starting to overcome that thanks to my sister's husband and my father treating her kindly. Surrounded by a kind family, my daughter and I are now leading a calm and happy life.